Hey guys, this is Andy doing another video for Blue Fire Poker. And today's video we're going to be talking about blind versus blind spots and specifically adjusting your game accordingly to your opponents. First off, I'm just going to come right out and say it. The biggest leak that players have blind on blind is not adjusting to their opponents. A lot of the forum threads that you see out there and a good amount of my students' questions are about blind versus blind spots. And rightfully so, because they happen so frequently in sit and goes and are the source of a lot of the edges in the game. Questions like, was this a bad shove? Did I call too wide here? I think he's on 82 cards, but I still folded. And the standard answer is just like anything else in poker. It's always, it depends. There is no cookie cutter range or answer for any of this because correct blind versus blind strategy in sit and goes nearly always depends on your opponent. And you can't profitably shove 100% from the small blind, every time against everybody. And likewise, you can't always assume that the small blind is going to be on any two cards. And the key is knowing your opponent and applying what they think and what their tendencies are in a given spot and tailor make your strategy to them. And in this respect, sit and go whiz and Nash are really huge. And today, we're going to be talking about what to look for in getting to know your opponent, learning what they think through stats, their past history, and what their motivations are. And then we'll see the thinking in action as well, as we'll look at a couple of blind versus blind hands that really illustrate how knowing your opponent can greatly affect your strategy. So, starting off with getting to know your opponent. The first question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of player are they? Are they regular, random recreational, or just a random? And generally, winning, tight aggressive, multi-tabling types will be pretty aggro, pushing the small blind into the big blind. And will call decently wide in the big blind. And of course, all this is adjusting according to their opponents. That's why they're good winning regs. Bad regs, the type that we've all seen, just push all small blinds and spike call extremely wide blind on blind. Not out of, they don't really discriminate on who their opponent is, who's doing the shoving, or who's going to be calling them, but they just have a default shove range, and they make it a variance fest for everybody, and that's why they're bad regs. And generally against these type of players, we do have to call them a little bit wider when they're shoving from the small blind. And we do have to push on them a little bit tighter as they are going to be more apt to snap us off. The third kind of reg is the nit regs. And they're my favorite because they're tights in the small blind. They basically never call in the big blind unless they have the top 5% of their range. And it seems like their motivation is, even though they're playing a massive number of tables, is to get down to 3 blinds, get queens, and get it in. That seems to be what they're there to do. And so, like I said, they're my favorite kinds of regs because we can just shove on their blind all day long and don't expect too much of a fight, and we can generally give their shoves a decent amount of respect. Recreationals can be a little bit more polarizing. You will get the stereotypical recreational player who just wants to play every hand, will shove wide and will call 12 blind shoves with queen 3 suited. Not out of an understanding of ICM or taking their opponent's range into account, but because it's their favorite hand and it was suited. And you really have to walk on eggshells around those types. But on the other side, you will find recreational types that are a little bit more nitty. And they're kind of like the nit regs in the respect that they're just waiting for aces blind on blind and play really fit or fold in the blinds and just generally sit there like a bump on the log. And lastly, the randoms are players that we don't have any stats on, we're just getting to know. And generally, I will give them the benefit of the doubt until they give me a reason to think not to. So when they're shoving from the small blind, I'm not going to immediately assume that they're going to be on 100%. Or if I'm in the small blind shoving in their big blind, I'm not going to assume that they're going to be snapping us off extremely wide. But when stats start building up, or if we start seeing them shove every single small blind, or they snap us off with a surprising hand blind on blind, and then we can adjust that read accordingly. Now, getting into stats, I put VPIP and preflop raise up there more as just a way to categorize those players into reg or recreational. A reg is going to be a little bit tighter, more like a 12-9 stats or 10-7, and recreational can just be all over the place. Basically, if you have a VPIP over 20, they're going to be pretty much all over the place. But the big stats I want to talk about are the steal from small blind percentage and fold big blind to small blind steal, because they can both be very helpful to generally gauge what your opponent is going to be doing in those situations, but they're not perfect. And they do take a long time to build up a number of hands to make the stat reliable. And while you can filter it for a number of players, shoving the small blind when there's 5 to 7 players, for example, it doesn't take into account effective stack size. A player is going to be generally going to be calling 100% if they have 1 blind behind, but if they have 10 blinds, it might be 10%. And more importantly, it doesn't take into account what they do against you. They could have a very small, say like 19% steal small blind percentage over 50 instances, but when you're in the big blind, they could shove the small blind 100% because they know that you're a nit and not going to call them very wide. The stat doesn't account for that. And that's why I think that personal past history is much more important when it comes to blind on blind spots. And you get that through observation. After a couple of hundred or even a couple thousand games, you start to get a feel for a player, what their range is going to be shoving in this spot, or how wide they're going to be calling in this spot as well. And does he spike call you wide on the bubble blind on blind, or does he push any 2 cards blind versus blind for less than 10 blinds effective? Have you spike called him before? Have you called him off with a wide range? And it's things like that that go beyond the stats, and it's something that only observations are going to tell you. And lastly, you need to think about what the villain is trying to accomplish. What's their motivation? Are they trying to own the bubble? Do they have to shove to keep their fold equity? Are they going to be priced in the big blind? Or say early in the sit and go, are they the type of player who will always flat a small blind raise and just try to outplay them post flop? And thinking this way will have a great effect on what range they could and should have in these spots. And figuring that out, as well as pairing the type of player they are and the personal history that you've built up with them, will really help you paint a picture of how they're going to react to a given situation. And therefore, it will make your actions against them much more accurate and profitable. And that being said, let's jump into a couple of hands. Now, the Ace 10 spot's pretty interesting. Alright, so it's T120 and folds around to us in the small blind, and we're 20 blinds deep against the big stack in the big blind. Now, the read that we have on the big blind is key for this hand. From what we've seen of him so far is that he's an aggressive player in position, blind on blind, and constantly raising small blind limpers from the big blind with a high frequency. And also, 2 experiences I've had in the sit and go is that he does have a tendency to float blind on blind with the intention of taking away later against a small blind raiser and c-bet. It could just be that he had it those 2 times in the sit and go, but I do get the feeling that that is his MO. And so looking for a little bit of revenge, and also we're looking to use these tendencies of the raising the limpers and the floating against him in this spot. So knowing those 2 tendencies, what is going to be the best way to get the money in this spot? Well, open shoving is going to be a plus EV, but it's probably not the best way to maximize here. Raise calling a 3-bet shove, or raise 4-betting a 3-bet. 20 blinds deep, I don't think he's going to be getting too out of line. Just 3-bet over shoving open it over a standard raise. And the range, I think he's going to be willing to 3-bet, call a 4-bet here. Ace 10 offsuit, even though it's a strong hand, blind on blind, we're probably not going to be too thrilled to begin it in against. Another option would be, put in a standard raise, 2.5 to like 300, and then c-bet a flop. And I think this option will be playing right into his hands. Ace 10, it's going to be strong, but we are going to miss the flop 2/3 of the time. Out of position against a tricky opponent, what we believe to be a tricky opponent in this spot. And even if say the flop comes down like King 10-3, and we c-bet and get called, and what do we do on the turn? Even though we're gonna standard size bets, we're gonna have a little bit more than a pot size bet behind against kind of a tricky, kind of floaty big blind who could be committed, and hands that he would even float with, like straight draws with overs and stuff like that. A king even would still have decent equity even if he's behind. So I think the best way to maximize in the spot is to either make it the pot as big as possible pre-flop or just keep it small, and we can accomplish that by limping. So I do end up limping here, and he does lean towards the more the first tendency, raising over the limps, and now that he's done that, we can shove over his raise, which it's likely going to be a wide range, and if we limped in here and he did check behind, that's fine too, because we're deep. We can keep the pot small out of position, and we've disguised the strength of our hand and possibly get streets of value from a lesser hand because of that. And once we limped in, the 5x raise did scare me a little bit, but we were on our path, and we're going to be shoving here. And he does end up giving it up, so it's nice for us. And now, if we did have a hand that was stronger, say like pocket jacks plus, then I think we can exploit his more floaty tendencies by putting in a standard raise and either looking to check shove most of the flops, or even c-bet, and if the board is dry enough, check shoving the turn. So I think this hand just illustrates the importance of using opponents' tendencies against themselves. And this next hand with the kings here just stresses the importance of stats and observance, and how observance can be more important than stats, especially over a small sample size. But the kings in this hand is actually kind of pointless. It just allows us to get to showdown here. But how wide would we be calling in this spot? So for the purpose of this hand, we're going to put ace-deuce offsuit in our hand in this spot. Now, a little bit about the small blind here. Let's see, my stats on him are, he was a pretty vanilla, like 18-9 over a few hundred hands, and he had a small blind steal percentage of 30% in 20 opportunities. So that's pretty low. And yeah, it is a small sample size, but generally I do give randoms like this the benefit of the doubt, and won't assume that they're going to be shoving any 2 cards in this spot until they can show me otherwise. And also with the small blind stat, as small as that is thrown in there, it's pretty safe to assume that he's not going to be shipping extremely wide in this spot. So we'll check it out in Wiz. And so knowing from we know about the stats, he's not going to be pushing extremely wide. So we can start off with any ace, any pair, Broadway combinations, and we can go a little bit wider than that. We'll say we'll give him about 30%, which from a tight random wouldn't be an unreasonable pushing range from the small blind. And so with the ace-deuce in our hand in this spot, and it turns into a clear fold, it'd be a pretty bad call against what we perceive to be a pretty tight range. But we'll actually play the hand out, and you can see he ends up with a not so premium part of the range. And so we'll reboot this in Wiz, and alright, so it's safe to assume that he's going to be shoving any 2 cards now, but say at 9-3 is going to be the bottom of the range, about 85%. And as you can see, the ace deuce goes from a clear fold to a clear call, and it'd be a pretty bad fold if we actually do give it up in this spot. And a lot of people will miss spots like this when they are multi-tabling. They'll just see the kings and they'll call and get it in, and even if they're tiling, but especially if they're stacking tables. And next time in a similar situation like this, they'll just see the stats. They'll see the small blind steal percentage, which will be 33 over 21 opportunities now, and they'll generally just give him the same benefit of the doubt that he's not going to be shoving an extremely wide range in this spot. So observation is really key, and reviewing hands later on, especially if you are multi-tabling and stacking especially, is extremely important, because you will miss spots like this if you're just going through the games. And from just observing this and beyond stats, the ace deuce spot here goes from a clear fold given his limited stats to a clear call against him going forward. And this next hand illustrates the importance of adjusting your strategy when your opponent knows how you think. All right, so it's five-handed, and we have exactly 9 blinds in the small blind, and the big blind is a solid reg who I have a lot of history with, and our dynamic is that he has called me wide in similar spots like these before, but after a few thousand games with the person, I do start getting the feeling that he is calling wide out of a knowledge of ICM and Nash calculations rather than just emotional, just like spite call wide blind on blind. We've all seen those types. And so looking at the situation now, 9 blinds in the small blind, he can assume correctly that our range is going to be very wide at this spot, and so he can call wide himself. And we'll just bring it up in Wiz real quick. So if you give us the 100% shoving range, which wouldn't be inconceivable, he can profitably call with over half of his range, which is massive. But we'll pull up the Nash calculation real quick. And then the equilibrium range is that if we're pushing just under 60%, he can profitably call with just over 30. But knowing that, I'm probably going to find a happy medium between the two. I'm going to be pushing wider than Nash for sure, but given our dynamic, I'm not going to be pushing it too. I might shear it down, pushing wide still for sure. Probably 80% would be a happy medium. And still, you can see that he can profitably call us in this spot with almost 40% of his hands, which is pretty significant range. So here's the dilemma that we have here, is that essentially our queens are like too good for us. Like, we have too good of a hand to be pushing here. But if we break from our pattern of shoving wide in this spot, if we limp trying to tarp him, or if we put in a min raise or 2.5 to try and deuce, I think that's essentially just going to stink to high heaven. Because if you have a good thinking player in the big blind, and all of a sudden you see a player who will almost always shove here with his entire range, just suddenly limp or put in a min raise or 2.5 with this size stack if you're in ruffian shoes, and you gotta be thinking to yourself, I wonder what he has here. He probably isn't trying to induce me with 7-4 offsuit. He probably has the top end of his range. So that really neuters the hands that we can get in against if we just shoved in this spot. Hands that would happily call and profitably call a shove in this spot against our range, like the lower offsuit aces, hands like King 9 and Queen Jack, might just shut it down if we limp and just try and get showdown cheap, or might just give it up against our inducing min raise or 2.5. So as much as it kind of stinks and it does seem like a waste of a perfectly strong hand like queens in this spot, I think our best opportunity to try and maximize our profits on this spot is just to shove, as odd as that sounds. Now, of course, if it was a weaker player in the big blind, it would be completely different. Then I would definitely advocate, going for a cute little min raise, or limping if there was an more aggressive player in the big blind. But yeah, and then we'll just run this out. And he does wake up with aces, but that's really a moot point in this hand. Uh, and we don't end up catching. But I think this hand illustrates how we do have to adjust when the big blind has knowledge of us, and it really dictates what we have to do in this given situation. And on the next one, we got 9-6 offsuit on the bubble in the small blind. And look around the players, we got Patrick and Mechal, which are both tighter regs, a little bit tighter than the usual. And Artem is kind of was a random at the time. Later found out he's a little bit on the looser side, so this actually might make the spot bad. But this bubble is actually pretty interesting because we've been four-handed since T240. So the last two levels, we've been on the bubble, and everyone's been pretty equal stack throughout. There's been a lot of walks, a lot of just raise folds, and no one has really stepped it up to become the chip leader. So when there's all medium stacks on the bubble in a four-horse race like this, sometimes I will start to go out of the way and shove a little bit wider in spots that Wiz would disagree with, because grabbing the chip lead on a bubble full of people who are playing not to bust is just a beautiful thing and will really help out our bottom line. So it folds around to us, of course, and the 9-6 offsuit here against a random, many people will pass here. It's unknown in the big blind who has us out chipped, and we still have a very good stack if we fold here. But if we shove and take this one down, we'll have 3350. And on the next hand, if we're given opportunity to shove the button, we will have both the blinds out chipped. And if we take that one down, which is pretty likely because Patrick's not going to be calling it off super wide here on the bubble, and we take that one down, we're going to be neck and neck with the chip leader. So we'll pull it up here in Wiz. And even against a average calling range, this is going to be slightly plus EV. And an average range they have here is pretty much any ace, any pair, any sort of broadways and stuff. And at the time, him being unknown, I think that's a fine range. Might be a little loose. I mean, the average player is probably not going to be, just spike calling off essentially their entire stack in tournament on the bubble here, blind on blind, with ace 3 or pocket deuces would be pretty hard pressed. And even then, if he is calling with this exact range, he's still going to be folding enough to make this worth our while. And I think it'll be fine here. And so, back to the action. He does call, and we shove, and he does call. And he shows up with ace king. Now I don't expect anyone to fold ace king here, especially if they know anything about me and how in spots like this I do like to aggressively try and chip up. So I think this will be fine call for him in this spot. But for those of you guys who like results, bink. And on the next one, it's three-handed, and it's folded around to the small blind, who I have quite a bit of history with. He's one of the reg types who doesn't really adjust, and have to me at least, and he ends up shoving the small blinds for 10 blinds effective. Now, from my history with him, this means that he has 2 cards, and that's about it. So, Queen 10 offsuit in this spot against this small blind, it's pretty much the nuts, and it's an immediate snap call. So, and we do end up getting it in here, and we'll take a look at Wiz, and with him at 100% in this spot, which isn't unreasonable, Queen 10's definitely going to be a call, and also we're going to be calling much wider, and it's going to be profitable to do so. And we'll say that we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he adjusts a little bit, and say drops the bottom 20% of his pushing range. Given that we are 10 blinds deep here, that Queen 10 still becomes a much more marginal call, but still a call nonetheless. Now, if the small blind had been a complete random or a tighter player that we don't have a whole lot of information on, I'm not going to assume that they're going to be pushing 100% in this spot. Maybe paring it down to something like, this seems a little tight in my opinion, but also not unheard of. Just any pair, any ace, a lot of the Broadway combinations. Let's include Queen Jack in there, because everybody loves Queen Jack. There we go. So shoving that sort of range, which is a little tight, like I said, but we're going to be calling much tighter in that spot against a much tighter range, justifiably so. And now, if the small blind had been one of the good regs that really adjust and lean more towards a Nash equilibrium strategy in this part, let's pull that up. And just looking at the Nash here, you should be shipping about a little under 60%, and in turn we can call with just over a quarter of our hands, and Queen 10 is going to be right on the margin. And if he's implying a Nash strategy like this, Queen 10 is going to be a close call, but it's going to be the bottom of my range for sure. As I will give the better egg credit for dropping the bottom end of his range when shoving into me. And this one is fun. Alright, so we're three-handed, and the big blind is a maniac, putting it mildly, at least in this sit and go. And you can see that we're three-handed. This was a 9-man sit and go, and it's still fairly early at T120. And basically, the big blind just vacuumed up everybody's chips, and it was really horrifying to watch. And I actually got my double up by Rays calling a shove with jacks at T40 against King 5. So yeah, and we'll keep that in mind. So now, looking around, we are the second stack by a wide margin. We have almost 30 blinds in our stack, but we're all still pretty deep. I mean, the big blinds has 14 blinds behind, so it wouldn't be a travesty if we did gamble it up against the chip leader here. And think about ways to get it in. We could limp here and hope for a shove, but I think that's a little too deep, being almost 30 blinds effective. But the line I like is raise inducing, which from what we've seen is likely to happen. So that's what we do, and we end up getting our wish. He raises to 660, which is kind of disconcerting. But anyways, he could be thinking in his mind, if he is thinking that we're the second stack, the third stack is short, he could think that he could shove here and take it because we're worried about that 10% jump in the prize pool. Or he could have a king again. But I think our hand is a little too good against him, and the shorty is deep enough where we can take this gamble here. And we'll toss into whiz real quick. Alright, so it's got us raising to 300 and the shove. And if he's only three bet shoving with a pretty tight range, 4s plus, ace 10, ace 8 suited, then as you can see we have to call pretty tight, even though it is going to be slightly plus EV. It does say that we should take an edge in this spot, but if you look at the chart, it's going to be plus EV pretty much all the way around. But as you can see, that even if he does get into any 2-card range, which is might be giving him too much credit, it still is only 0.5% plus EV. So it's going to be pretty thin all the way around, just because we are so deep here. But plus EV nonetheless. And we'll run it out. And we do call, and he shows up with ace queen. Story of my life. which is really disappointing because he could have easily just shown up with, like king queen or ace six offsuit here in this spot, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least. But we are able to fade that. And the last interesting piece I want to bring up about this hand is how stack sizes affect what we can do here. All right, say we'll half the button stack, so he'll be on just over 7 blinds, and we'll give those chips to the big blind. So nothing changes for us, but the short stack is going to be much shorter, and as you can see, it really will hinder our calling range of what we can call within this spot. As you can see, it starts off decently plus EV, but it dips massively just because we are so deep in comparison to the new third stacks level. And so what used to be, it basically inverts once he gets past a 30% shoving range. Remember last time when the big blind had a full stack, it dipped like this and then just shot up. But this one, with the the button being shorter, it really turns into a fold once he's shoving with any sort of range. So I guess always be aware of effective stack size. I know it's really important and you guys do that before the bubble, but even in the money, in small spots like this where there is a quote-unquote small bubble for that extra 10% between third and second, and it is really interesting how effective stack sizes can affect that. Next up, we're on the bubble. We have the third stack, and we're in the small blind with king jack of diamonds. And now there's a short stack here, and he folds under the gun. The second stack folds, and it gets to us. And normally here, if the big blind was a reg, excuse me, I should mention that the big blind was an unknown player at the time. But if the big blind player was just like a random reg, I would shove this despite the shorty being around. Especially if he was the type of reg that I don't really have any spike call history with. There's no bad blood around. And we'll take a look in Wiz real quick. Alright, so if he's on 25%, this is going to be a fold, but most regs aren't going to be calling it off super wide here out of spite. They do have the chip lead in the spot, and even though I might be shoving wide, there's really no need in their minds to really risk their chip lead in a pissing contest with me. And my range isn't even going to be that wide because I'm not going to be shoving 100% from the small blind with that shorty around for sure. So he's going to have to tighten up his range quite a bit. Like I think the an average thinking regular would be kind of hard pressed to call it off blind on blind in a spot here with, say, like pocket fours. But we'll give him a little bit more credit. We'll say fours, ace nine, ace five suited is starting to get a little thin because of the reasons we talked about. But still, even if he's calling that sort of range, we can still push pretty wide. I don't think I would shove any two cards because king jack, as you can see, is going to be a perfectly fine shove. But if we gave ourselves like king four offsuit, as you can see that the EV differential is cut in half. Not nearly as good in this spot. And also, if we shove here and if he calls us down, this could really inspire some future spite, which I really don't want, especially on the bubble. I don't want to antagonize him. So, I just want to stick to pretty snug range in the spot and shove value, and I think we'll be fine. But since the big blind is an average player, not average, unknown player at the time, he might not think this way. We'll go back to the average 25% range, and he might just look at his hand, look at any ace, any pair, and just be like, I have the best hand. I'm gonna call you. And so, against a big blind like that, we really, really need to tighten up in this spot. As you can see, even king jack suited would be a negative EV fold if the big blind's calling range is as such. And being unknown, it easily could be. Could be tighter, it could be looser, but this is our best estimate right here. And so it is kind of neat how the shorty just affects things. And you know, just for shiz, we'll change it up. We'll even out the stacks a little bit. We'll give 1,000 to the shorty and take 1,000 from the second stack. So as you can see, that's going to be very bunched up between the second and the fourth stacks here. And then the king jack suited becomes a push, as once the even stacks out, even though our chips don't change, we're going to have less equity to protect in this tournament, so we can afford to be a little bit more aggressive, even against the same 25% calling range. And so that's why but since the stacks aren't even, there is a shorty. I did end up giving up the small blind. And this spot is not fun. This is, I hate replaying this hand, but here we go. All right, so it's six-handed, and it gets around to the blinds here, and we have a very comfortable stack, just under 12 blinds, and the chip leader shoves on us. And this is a spot where you know your opponent, but the situation dictates your reaction. This is going to be a textbook example of that. Now, from what we know about the small blind ZZQ is that my note on him actually back in the day was he never folds the small blind, no matter what. And he didn't show signs of adjusting to me once I started calling him wider. So we know that about the small blind. And with that in mind, in a vacuum, if it's just me and him, this is a snap call because the ace-7 suited is going to be the nuts against him. So I do make the snap call, and it is a terrible, terrible, massive mistake in this spot because I was blinded by who was shoving in the small blind, and I failed to take into account the situation. So before we get into Wiz, just taking a look around, basically just 3 people have the chips. Our HFR is extremely short, and with these 2 being significantly short as well, this is essentially a bubble spot. So this call here is going to be almost as bad as like calling off all of my chips on the bubble second stack if he was the chip leader. And we'll toss into Wiz in this spot. And actually, we'll pull up Nash first because, as you can see, it's actually pretty interesting. It basically is a bubble spot because equilibrium, he can be shoving any 2, and we have to be calling significantly tight here, very similar to what a bubble spot would be. And as you can see, he's definitely not pushing 14%, but we'll say he did show up a jack-8 of clubs, so we'll put that at the bottom end of his range, about shoving 40% of his hands. Even then, we still have to call very, very snug. And we'll just pull up the chart, and you can see it's even at 100%. This is a negative EV spot, and it's just really terrible all the way around. Now that we have time to go back and look at this, and man, it's just because you can see if we fold here, we still have 24.22% equity in this tournament, which is at 6-handed is just absolutely massive. So this really does reflect very closely to a bubble spot. And as you can see, if the jack-8 suited was at the bottom end of his range, this is going to be negative over 3.5% for us. And if we do give him the almighty 100%, it's better, but it's still a negative 1%, which is still pretty bad for us in this spot. But let's watch the carnage. I guess you can see why I'm kind of angry about this because, well, we got blinded by the situation and we made a bad call, and somehow poker karma works itself out. Generally, bad plays are not rewarded. Well, especially if they're your bad plays. Other people's bad plays always get rewarded. But I think this spot is a really good lesson, is that while it really is paramount to be aware of your opponent and know what they're capable of, sometimes just the situation does dictate and take precedent over who and what the villain is. And next I want to talk about a short stack trick in the small blind that works against regs and fish alike for different reasons. All right, so it folds around to us, and we're short, and we got the 10-3 offsuit, and Ravik 85 is in the big blind, who is a very good reg and a mass multi-tabler. And so if we shove here, when the table pops up, he's going to see the odd number, and he's going to call wide accordingly, as a good player would. But if we make a raise here, like a standard raise that we make if we had a full stack or a big stack behind, to 600, once the screen pops up, he'll immediately see the 600 as opposed to the raggedy number shove, and he might just assume right away that this is a standard raise, and he could fold out a lot of stuff that would have called a shove, but doesn't want to play in a raise pot against a bigger stack. And sometimes it works, sometimes they don't see that you only have 640 behind, and he fold more of a range that he would have called with. And if he shoves here, of course we're calling, we're getting odds, and we would have gotten it in anyways. And if this has ever been done to you, it's so annoying because you usually see the 640 just as you're releasing the fold button, and you got like King 7 is like, oh, I don't want to play against a raised. Oh, 640. But and also this also works against fish, and for the same thing, if they shove, we're absolutely calling, and if they fold, probably not because they're multi-tabling, but if they're not paying attention, or if they somehow see this small raise as extreme strength, that also works too. But it also works if a weaker player flats in the spot, which is something a good reg would never do unless they know exactly what you're doing, and then they decide to mind screw you and just flat with aces and to laugh at you. But back to the fish. All right, so if they flat you here with, gosh knows what, then you're going to have a free bullet to fire on the flop, a little over half pot bet, and you will get a great deal of folds. Hands that don't connect, speculative hands like he had like 5-4 suited, and he wanted to see a flop before he committed, and comes down like ace king 4, excuse me, ace king 8, and then you're firing because you're firing anyway, and then he might give that up. So that's just a little trick that sometimes you can employ if you have very marginal fold equity in the small blind, and it's about creating fold equity when there is none, and whenever it does work against anybody, it makes me smile a little bit. So that also helps too. And we'll end the video today with a pretty common spot that people sometimes have trouble with. When you get junk in the small blind, late in a sit and go against the big blind, and it gets around to us. 8-3 offsuit, it's pretty junky, not the best. It's okay in blackjack, so I hear, but poker not so much. And the big blind is an unknown, so if you want to fold this, I guess it's okay, since it just is so terrible and the bottom end of your range. But I really hate folding the big blind here without a good reason. And since he's the unknown, we have no read that he's going to be calling it off wide here late. So I think if in my spot, I'm going to be shoving this until he starts showing some backbone and starts calling it off a little wider. And we'll pull this up in Wiz. And this is going to be A2 shove against a 33% range. Where's the break-even point? About 40%. So we'll plug that in, see what it looks like. Yeah, then the 8-3 starts becoming border. We could shove 8-4, 8-3 not so much, but so the 40% call-in range includes, of course, any pair, any ace, pretty much any king, and most of the suited queens, and a lot of the smaller connected face cards. And so it wouldn't be that terrible of a calling range in that spot. I don't expect an unknown just to stack it off here with like king 5 off, maybe like queen 6 suited. So I think his calling range is going to be a little bit tighter on that until he just shows us otherwise and snaps us off with like 10-5 suited. So, if we pare that down a little bit, maybe like a king 8, king 4 suited probably. No one's folding queen 10 or queen 9 suited here. So, then that turns back into a shove, and pretty decent spot to shove here. If this was a better player, we'll pull up the Nash real quick. Now, if it was a better player who I could see, understanding what we're doing in the small blind and starts calling wider, it says the equilibrium point is going to be about a 44% calling range. And so once he starts calling wider than that in this spot, then our wide pushing range becomes pretty bad. And as you can see, even at equilibrium, A3 offsuit's not included. We can't even shove the almighty 8-4. So I guess we'll take that out. But the thing is, if he shows up with aces or ace king, I'm still going to shove this every single time. If they only call with the top end of the range, we're simply not pushing enough because they're calling way too tight. So, if we do run into the big hand, I'm not going to be too bummed about this. Now, if he showed up with queen 4 offsuit, and then I might start rethinking things a little bit, as I think the jig is up. And that was the video for today, guys. I hope we were able to dish out some good information about blind on blind spots and how your opponents affect. And I'm thinking about turning this blind versus blind into a series. Maybe a couple more videos covering exclusively like bubble blind on blind spots and those implications, or early blind on blind hands, or even submitted members hands. So let me know what you think in the comments. And as far as today, this has been Andy, Raised Agent Carlson, signing off.